It was a normal Friday, November 8, 1957. At 11:30 a.m., a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser named Romans of the Skies, registration PA944, was preparing to take off from San Francisco, California. It was flying to Honolulu, Hawaii, with 8 crew members and 36 passengers. Everyone thought this would be a unique and luxurious experience. The Boeing they were on was truly the pinnacle of aviation at that time. It had 2 large passenger cabins, spacious seating, full-service light meals, and a small cocktail lounge for customers to kill time. In the 50s, PanAm Airlines was at the forefront of air passenger service. They became the most trusted name for flights with 5-star service, specializing in serving the rich in America, and this trip was no different. Little did they know that what was about to happen, just a few hours later, would become one of the greatest mysteries in the history of aviation. You are following BVT Media Discovery Channel to discover the strange story of PanAm Flight 7. Like its legendary predecessor, the B-314, the Stratocruiser was an unparalleled masterpiece of size, speed, and luxury. When Boeing introduced it to the world in 1947, it was dubbed the Castle of the Air. Romance of the Skies had Pullman-style beds, separate dressing rooms for men and women, and a horseshoe-shaped cocktail lounge in the belly of the plane. The seats on the plane could be reclined to become beds, and there was an incredible amount of legroom of up to 1.2 meters. Not only that, the class of the flight was also shown in many other details. The standard 7-course dinner for short-haul flights began with champagne and caviar served on china. And the first-class meals on the Maxim of Perry transatlantic flights were in charge. Even at full takeoff weight, the Boeing 377 was faster than its 2 direct commercial competitors, the Douglas DC-6 and the Lockheed Constellation, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R-4360 Wasp major engines. The largest piston engines ever built gave it a top speed of 350 miles per hour and a staggering 13 tons of payload. Before takeoff, the Romance of the Skies cargo hold was filled with luggage, mail, movie sets, medicine, food, and a new IBM computer. The passengers on board reflected the respectable socio-economic status of those who could afford to pay $300 for a ticket to Hawaii or $1,600 for a round-the-world trip. If you don't know, $1,600 is the equivalent of $10,500 today. Who were those people? First up, we have Robert Lamaison, Vice President of Ronald Auto and a French World War II Air Force pilot, on vacation with his wife Nicole. William Hagen, a renowned surgeon for love, and his wife Norma are scheduled to attend a medical conference in Honolulu. Lee Clack, the general manager of the chemical company in Tokyo, is returning home with his family after the flight. Edward Ellis, vice president and general manager of sales for a spice company, is eager to tour his company's overseas plantations. Soledad Mercado, a fashion designer from Phoenix, is hoping to find new clients overseas, and there are many other notables on board. Robert Alexander, a PanAm Airlines pilot, is planning a fishing trip to the islands with his wife and their 2 children upon arrival. William Deck, 24, was heading to Kyoto to marry a Japanese woman he had met while serving in the U.S. Navy. Foreign Service Officer Thomas McGrail was on his way to Yangon, Myanmar, to serve as a cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy there. The passengers had clear plans or missions for their trips. They were simply enjoying themselves. All the relevant information was transparent, as were the crew members, all of whom had a certain level of expertise and experience. The commander of Flight 944 that day was Captain Golden Brown, 40 years old, a veteran pilot with 15 years of experience with the airline. First Officer Winwagon, who had worked for PanAm for more than a decade, and young flight engineer in Pintera, who was studying electrical engineering at night at a community college in preparation for promotion. Senior flight attendant Yvonne Alexander, a beautiful blonde, struggled every day to care for her ailing father in San Francisco. Flight attendant Mary McGrath, 26, was a dynamic brunette who her friends would remember as beautiful and wise, and even while studying at Seneca College in upstate New York, Mary dreamed of one day flying for PanAm. You may find the information about the passengers and crew too long and difficult to remember, but believe me, it is extremely necessary and plays an important role in solving the puzzle of this mysterious disappearance. 11:30 a.m., PanAm flight departed as scheduled. All technical checks and preparations were carried out without any abnormalities. The journey was simply a direct flight from California to Hawaii. However, the flight distance was relatively long. It was expected to take about 9 hours and 30 minutes to complete. Therefore, according to regulations, the plane was required to register with the ship to ensure that they were on the right track. At 16:04 p.m., local time from an altitude of more than 3 kilometers, Captain Brown sent a routine radio position report to Pontchartrain, a Coast Guard weather ship stationed in the Pacific to assist the plane in its flight. Romance of the Skies had just passed the point of no return and was on track and on schedule, 1866 kilometers from Honolulu and about 10 miles east of Ponch. The sky was clear and the sea was calm with the sun low in the western sky. The captain informed ground control that he would be in touch again at 1800 hours. However, the appointed time came, with no information from the flight. After 2 hours of no contact, the Coast Guard began a search. The U.S. Coast Guard and Navy used aircraft, submarines, and even the USS Philippine Sea aircraft carrier. The entire 380,000 square kilometers area of the Pacific Ocean was searched for days, with every possibility whether they could find anything. For nearly 60 years, those seriously interested in Pan American Flight 7 have accepted the words of the U.S. Civil Aeronautics Board, CAB, that there was insufficient physical evidence at this time to determine the cause of the crash. But the details that have been found tell a different story. After days of searching, the first clues emerged, with debris found 90 miles north of the flight path, which led to 2 possibilities. Either the plane deliberately veered off course and crashed, or the plane crashed and crashed. 14 of the 19 bodies found were wearing life jackets but no shoes, suggesting that some had been prepared for the plane to crash into the sea. Yvonne Alexander's body was still strapped into his seat, with his seatbelt and life jacket secured, and the floating debris of the fuselage and mangled cabin suggested that the plane had crashed with its nose down slightly. Although some of the bodies found showed signs of impact trauma, the CAB report stated that most of the victims drowned, meaning that Romance of the Skies was not completely out of control on the final impact, and that the wreckage had burn marks, which were above the waterline, indicating that there was a fire after the crash, but there was no evidence of a fire while the plane was in the air. PanAm and the FBI suspected foul play in the investigation reports issued by the U.S. Civil Aeronautics Board. This suspicion was further increased when autopsies from the bodies found unusually high levels of carbon monoxide in 4 of the bodies, and the gas was present in the blood of Captain Brown and all those seated in the front and rear, suggesting that it had spread throughout the passenger cabin. So why did the CAB say there was no evidence of a mid-air fire? On November 18, 1957, when the aircraft carrier Philippine Sea docked in Long Beach with bodies and debris recovered, a dispute broke out on the dock between CAB representatives and FBI agents over who had jurisdiction over the case. The dispute escalated into a full-fledged interagency fight, which the CBA ultimately won. In retaliation, FBI Director Jedgard Hoover backed away from the investigation. Ignoring pleas from both the airline and the head of the CAB, Hoover left the question of who caused the PA944 disaster to the Federal Aviation Administration. Meanwhile, those with a special interest in this mysterious accident took action of their own. They began their investigation by posting questions on a website run by former PanAm employees, mostly about the crew members of the flight, and were met with a flood of responses from more than 20 pilots, navigators, flight engineers, and flight attendants who knew the deceased. More importantly, the former PanAm employees revealed that the airline had suspected one of its own in 1957 of causing the disaster, but who exactly? Former colleagues revealed that the 46-year-old steward of the Crossweight plane had previously been in trouble with PanAm for his erratic behavior, and that Crosswaite had bragged about deliberately dropping a meal on the galley floor before serving it to a captain who he felt had insulted him. Crosswaite blamed PanAm for some of his misfortunes, including tuberculosis, which he contracted in Shanghai while working as a steward on the airline's planes. Although he had fully recovered from his illness, Crosswaite was devastated by the death of his wife Julie from cancer, which left him as sole guardian of Tanya, Julie's daughter from a previous marriage, and the relationship between father and daughter was strained. On November 3rd, just days before the flight, Crosswaite called the county sheriff's office to complain to his daughter, whom he called a devil. He also blamed Tanya for his wife's death, and Crosswaite even amended his will early in the morning of the flight, denying Tanya her inheritance unless she lived a moral and upright Catholic life. A copy of the document was found in the glove compartment of Crosswaite's car parked at the airport. PanAm considered the altered will to be clear evidence that Crosswaite had intended to commit suicide. The CAB also assigned one of its investigators, Carl Schonberger, to look into Crosswaite's background, an investigation that seemed to build up further evidence against the flight manager. According to witness testimony, Crosswaite's father-in-law recalled that the suspect had shown him a handful of explosives a few days before the flight took off, and despite extensive searches, neither Carl Schonberger nor Crosswaite's father-in-law could find any explosives among the flight manager's belongings. For Schonberger, the biggest piece of evidence was a casual suggestion that Tanya had made about her stepfather to the police chief. Tanya thought it was possible that Crosswaite had killed himself and killed the flight because he was too cowardly to travel alone. But just as PanAm seemed ready to conclude, 10 months after the tragedy, that the flight manager had caused the disaster, a new suspect emerged. 41 years old William Harrison Penn, a passenger on Romance of the Skies, was believed to be on his way to Hawaii to collect an overdue debt. Penn owned a hunting lodge outside Scott Bar, California, a small town near the Oregon border. What motive could a man of such relative financial means have for such an act? It was discovered that just before the flight, Penn had taken out 3 life insurance policies on himself, one of which had a clause that would pay the policyholder double the amount in the event of accidental death. The other 2 policies, from different companies, would have paid a total of $125,000 to his wife in the event of a similar event. However, this is not entirely satisfactory. It is difficult for anyone to exchange their life for money if life is still completely good. There must be something fishy about this. Perhaps we need to look further to understand everything better. Penn's story was brought to light in the pages of the San Francisco Examiner under the headline, "The Real Conspiracy of the Mid-Pacific Plane Crash." The source for this story was Russell Stiles, an investigator for Western Life Insurance Company, one of the insurance companies that Penn had purchased. While awaiting the results of Stiles' investigation, Western Life withheld payment to the victim's wife. Upon learning of Penn's background, Stiles went to the FBI but had to leave in disappointment because, as stated, the FBI would not get involved further in the case. Stiles' subsequent investigation only deepened the belief that Penn had caused the plane crash to collect insurance money and that Penn had never actually been on Romance of the Skies. Stiles discovered that the suspect had previously been in trouble with the law for attempting to illegally collect tolls on public roads every time a truck carrying lumber passed through. Under threat of arrest, he detonated a landmine on the road, rendering the road unusable. After interviewing people who knew Penn, Stiles finally found a possible motive for the crime. Penn owed his mother $10,000 for maintaining his failing hunting lodge, which was up for sale. In June 1958, 7 months after PanAm Flight 7 crashed, Penn married a friend and former neighbor of her husband. 2 days later, while the newlyweds were still on their honeymoon in Mexico, Penn's Rossberry Road hunting lodge burned to the ground. Although the authorities suspected arson, the insurers, faced with the prospect of being sued by Harry, quietly agreed to settle the claim. While the postmaster in Scott Bar told Stiles that Harry and her new husband had begun receiving mysterious letters and packages from overseas that were never returned. In the late 1970s, independent investigators tracked the retired Stiles to a small mountain town in Colorado. He declined repeated requests for personal interviews, but his daughter revealed that Stiles was never satisfied with the outcome of the official investigation into the incident. Even after retiring from Western life, he continued to investigate Penn at his own expense. Stiles remained convinced that Penn was not only alive, but might be plotting revenge. According to Stiles' daughter, until the day he died in March 1999, her father feared that Penn would one day come after him. A man who had sabotaged an entire flight for the insurance money was probably too small a life for Stiles. While Penn suspected Crosswade and Western Life of paying Penn, some CAB investigators blamed a different culprit: mechanical problems. The Boeing 377 has a history of propeller problems. The original Hamilton standard hydromatic propellers were 7 foot long, hollow-core steel propellers lined with rubber. But centrifugal force tended to push the synthetic rubber in the core toward the tip of the propeller, creating an imbalance and in some cases causing pieces of the propeller to fly off, as happened with the wreckage of a PanAm Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, which crashed in the Brazilian jungle in 1952. Investigators discovered that it had actually broken into pieces after losing control of a propeller blade and then an engine. A propeller that was too tight or spinning too fast was a nightmare for any crew. A propeller spinning abnormally fast would also cause the plane to accelerate suddenly, and what was even more frightening was that propeller-driven loss of control could occur with little warning, and the pilot had only seconds to react. A year earlier, a propeller and engine failure forced Romance of the Skies' sister ship, Clipper Sovereign of the Skies, to make an emergency takeoff en route from Hawaii to San Francisco near the site of the crash. After circling until dawn, Sovereign landed safely, and all 31 passengers and crew were able to evacuate the plane before it sank completely. Curiously, the final CAB report on PanAm Flight 7 made little mention of the previous overspeed, and claimed that Romance of the Skies had never experienced an overspeed incident, but a phone call from one of PanAm's veteran liaison officers and former B-377 pilot Clint Smith contradicted that claim, saying that he had been at the controls of Romance of the Skies when it suffered a propeller failure on a flight to Hawaii in June 1957, just 6 months before it crashed, and that he had been able to land the plane safely at the airport. The final pieces of the mystery may have come from 2 other former experts, Frank Garcia and Tony Vasco. For decades, flight engineer Garcia suspected that the cause of the Sovereign of the Skies' propeller loss was a small part of the engine's nose nacelle that transferred oil to the propeller ring. Failure of the oil transfer tube or the housing connected to the dome would have caused the propeller structure to become misaligned. But convincing evidence of Garcia's story still lies at the bottom of the ocean. So what does Tony Vasco have to say? Tony Vasco was the engineering director at Eastern Airlines until his retirement in 1990. An expert on aircraft engines and propellers, Vasco was a frequent contributor to prestigious aviation and technical journals, and he found evidence that PanAm, manufacturers, and the Federal Aviation Administration had realized at the time of the Romance of the Skies crash that the oil transfer tube was welded rather than bolted into place. In short, mechanical problems may have been a significant factor in PanAm Flight 7 never returning home. In any case, the final verdict was reached, and it still stands today. It took a series of intense hearings to review and systematize all the available evidence. The CAB's formal hearings into the crash of PA944, called Sign Romance of the Skies, began on the morning of January 15, 1958, in a crowded conference room at San Francisco's stately Sir Francis Drake Hotel. Over 2 days, 5 investigators from the CAB Safety Bureau examined 90 artifacts, including personal effects salvaged from the crash site. They interviewed 19 witnesses, including maintenance workers, linemen, and other PanAm employees. The Bureau's experts paid little attention to the possibility of sabotage, focusing instead on the possibility of engineering as we have just analyzed together. On the second day of the hearing, the CAB investigators considered the possibility that the crew of Flight 944 had sent a distress call, but some factors had caused the connected vehicles to not hear it clearly. The audio signals made on the day of the crash were recorded by AR Inc.'s receiving stations in San Francisco, Los Angeles. The board also collected audio recordings and sent them to audio experts at Bell Labs for analysis. Bell engineers could not find any messages on the tapes, except in one case. 15 minutes after the captain's last routine radio report, they heard a distorted transmission containing the words 44, presumably referring to the PanAm call sign of Flight 944. Independently, a group of PanAm pilots who were close friends of the crew of Flight 944 also listened to the recordings. They said that the recordings did indeed contain a message, but that the words were faint and indecipherable or nonsensical. The pilots eventually informed the CAB that the majority of the words and phrases used in the message were unfamiliar to us radio telephone operations. Some of the words were clearly inconsistent with the situation under investigation. They considered it unlikely that the message as read in the report originated from PA944. On January 16, 1958, the Safety Board experts adjourned, and after more than 16 testimonies and hundreds of documents, they failed to reach a consensus on the cause of the crash. In their report, the CAB investigators expressed more certainty than the PanAm pilots that no radio messages had been received from the plane after the emergency began. On January 17th, the day after the official investigation concluded, audio engineers from the Dictaphone Corporation volunteered to retest the AR Inc. recordings. After 2 weeks of using advanced equipment lent by the Voice of America, Dictaphone claimed to have decoded a weak transmission from Romance of the Skies, a discovery compelling enough to convince the CAB to send the AR Inc. tapes to other audio experts for further analysis. And here the crash investigation took a rather strange turn. One of the most dramatic moments of the hearing came from Finn Ice, president of the Transport Workers Local 505 Union, whose members maintain Pan American's fleet of planes in San Francisco. Ice lamented that PanAm had cut inspection staff, leading to dangerous deficiencies in inspection and maintenance. On the 9-hour flight from the West Coast to Hawaii, first-class passengers could stretch out in the spacious cabin, enjoy drinks in the cocktail lounge on the plane's lower deck, then sit down to a 7-course dinner. Passengers on overnight flights to Europe and Asia slept in Pullman-style beds. PanAm was losing money on the Stratos and planning to replace them with faster, cheaper jets, until the company decided to save money by adopting some controversial expedited maintenance measures, such as having mechanics sign off on spreadsheets rather than supervisors, and running only 1/3 of the engine on the propeller on a test stand after overhaul. The irresponsibility of maintenance was exposed. While Penn was contesting Ice's allegations, CAB inspectors took them seriously enough to visit the airline's San Francisco maintenance shop unannounced after the hearing. They reported to their superiors that there was inadequate inspection or quality control during the engine overhaul, and that maintenance practices were questionable. Even more alarming, the disappearance of 944 was not an isolated incident. The airline, which billed itself as the world's most experienced airline, had recently suffered a series of Stratocruiser disasters, with 3 PanAm B373s failing over the Pacific in the space of 3 years. In 1955, the number 3 engine and propeller of a United States clipper en route to Honolulu broke free of the wing, falling off the plane and causing it to shake violently and spin out of control. Although the pilot eventually regained enough control to land the plane off the coast of Oregon, 2 passengers and 2 crew members died from exposure or drowning. Influential journalist Grill Pison used his nationally syndicated column to publicize these incidents, which seemed to confirm that PanAm's maintenance practices had been neglected. During the CAB hearings on PA944, testimony regarding the aircraft's maintenance history was rife with contradictions, inconsistencies, and even outright misrepresentations. Maintenance logs introduced into evidence at the hearing told another disturbing story. In the weeks leading up to the accident, 944's engines had been experiencing fluctuating oil pressure, leaks from the turbochargers, and persistent cooling problems. In May 1958, Jay Kinwell, a lawyer representing PanAm, wrote to CAB official Robert Schiff to object to Chris's plan to cite PanAm's sloppy maintenance in the government report. In a private letter to the airline's legal department, Kinwells candidly admitted that he hoped to persuade Chris to hide the maintenance report from the public record. Pressure was mounting for a final resolution to the case. By October 1958, nearly a year after 944, Oscar Beck, director of the Safety Bureau, informed his superiors that, due to the large number of requests for reports from the public, relatives, and members of Congress, further delays were unacceptable. 2 months later, the government released its final report on the disappearance of Romances of the Skies. While the CAB acknowledged that it was entirely possible that the crew had sent a distress call, the board could not determine with certainty that any distress transmissions had come from PA944. Also unexplained was the mystery surrounding the carbon monoxide in some of the bodies. While the CAB report acknowledges that the board found some irregularities in the airline's maintenance practices, the absence of a clear distress call and the lack of physical evidence from the crash make it impossible to link it to the crash. The report does not address Finn Ice's allegations of poor maintenance, nor will the reader find any acknowledgement that the report's conclusions are controversial. Ultimately, the mystery of PanAm Flight 7 remains unsolved, unless technology advances to the point where we can search the ocean floor for the remains of romances or find evidence that William Penn was still alive after November 8, 1957. Otherwise, questions about the tragedy will linger for years to come. So what do you think really turned PanAm Flight 7 from a luxury flight into a journey to hell? It is human calculation for personal purposes, or due to technical errors caused by the irresponsibility of related departments? Please leave comments below this video so that we can clarify the matter together. And now we say goodbye and see you again in the next videos. Wish everyone a good day.